Hey everybody, we're going to do a little, I guess, a short mini review and glance through of the Warrior, Rogue, and Mage role-playing game by Michael Wolff. This is a free game, and I will post a link to where you can find it down in the notes section below. But this is a very simple game where you have stats, but you don't have classes. It's a fantasy game where your class is your stat. Like, so for example, it's Warrior, Rogue, and Mage. Those are your three stats, and they govern the abilities of what you would think. Like a Warrior stat would be all your physical stuff, your strength and whatnot. Your Rogue attribute would be your dexterity and things like that, and your nimbleness. And your Mage attribute would be your intelligence and your wisdom and your capacity for magic, things like that. And it says here, although Warrior, Rogue, and Mage uses three basic fantasy RPG classes in its name, it doesn't make use of classes. Players are encouraged to create their characters freely without having to fit them into archetypical roles, which I may have just pronounced wrong. Warrior, Rogue, and Mage are actually the characters' base attributes, which measure their capabilities in combat, stealth, and academics, respectively. So we've got a number of chapters here. Chapter 1 is characters. Chapter 2 is rules and mechanics. Chapter 3 is combat. Chapter 4 is magic. Chapter 5 is equipment. Chapter 6 is game mastering. Chapter 7 is the world. And this world is sort of a generic fantasy. There's not a lot of information about the world itself. There's a little bit here and there, but it's really very basic and very simple, and you can either use your own world or kind of flesh out what information is given to you about this world. And then there's a couple appendixes, skills and talents, optional rules. There's a bestiary, and then there's tables and a character sheet. As it says, what is Warrior, Rogue, and Mage? It's a simple, lightweight role-playing game that allows a group of players and a game master to experience adventures in a fantasy world filled with conflict, monsters, and wondrous magic, which, is kind of typical of any fantasy role-playing game. It's got the typical, what are characters, that type of deal. Now that we're getting into both sides of the paper, I'm going to move the video or move the book over a little bit. But so chapter 1, characters, goes over the attributes. Each attribute is usually ranked from 0 to 6, but monsters or veteran characters could have a higher value. If you have an attribute ranked at 0, you can't use any skills related to the attribute. In the case of the Mage attribute, if it were 0, you couldn't cast even the simplest spell. Characters with a high rank in Warrior are, like born fighters that says that they're strong, tough, and fearless. And characters with a low Warrior attribute, they're weaker, they're less daring, less courageous, things like that. Someone with a high Rogue attribute is witty, stealthy, and quick. And a low Rogue attribute might mean the character is clumsy or something such like that. A high Mage attribute is a sign of intelligence, strength, and mental discipline. Strength of will, I should say. Where a low Mage attribute could mean that you're dull or easily influenced or, forgetful or something like that. So each player starts with 10 attribute levels that you can put wherever you want, and you can't start any attribute higher than 6. And it recommends that you don't necessarily have a super specialized character, because then you'll falter in other areas. But so the other couple of things here are skills, and skills are just like you'd think in any other fantasy game. It says here like riding or thievery or athletics, things like that. You start with 3 skills, skill points to choose. What happens is, if you have a skill, it's not like a cumulative skill like in, say, D&D, where it's +1, then it becomes +2, then +3, and eventually +8 or 9, whatever. If you have a skill in Warrior, Rogue, and Mage, it's literally, you have that skill and you have a +2 bonus to all your rolls. Talents are kind of like feats, the equivalent of feats in D&D. You don't have to roll a die to use talents. As soon as you get them, you get them. Hit points, fate, and mana. So hit points obviously are just like D&D or any other fantasy game where you level up and you gain hit points. Fate is, it says here that fate can be used to save one's life in certain situations or take over some narrative control from the GM. And then mana is just like you'd think. It's mana points to fuel your spells. So each character starts with hit points equal to 6 plus your warrior attribute, and fate equal to the rogue attribute, and mana equal to 2 times your mage attribute. If your rogue attribute is 0, you still start with 1 fate point. Then you've got armor and defense. Your defense stat, just like your AC, equivalent of AC, is equal to half the sum of your warrior and rogue attributes rounded down, plus 4. If you wear armor or use a shield, it grants a bonus to your defense, but raises the mana cost of spells by their armor penalty. So a mage could wear armor, but it just makes it harder to cast spells. So unlike D&D, it doesn't rule out mages wearing armor. It just makes it harder for them to do it. So Chapter 2, the rules mechanics. Every time you want to do something, you just take one die, one 6-sided die, and you add the relevant attribute level to your roll. Like say you wanted to, or climb a tree, for example. You would roll 1d6 and add your rogue attribute, which would be the equivalent of, say, your dexterity in another game. And if you had a skill that might help in the situation, you could add 2 to that result. And then you'd compare that number to the difficulty assigned by the GM. It says here an optional rule is if your character knows more than one skill that could be used in the situation, the GM might allow the player to add another to the result. And you have what's called the exploding die, which some other games have. Whenever you roll a 6 on a damage roll, a natural 6 on a damage roll, or an attribute check that does use the appropriate skill, your die could explode, which means you add 6, roll again, and add that. If it's another 6, you just keep rolling until you don't get a 6. If you roll a 6 but you don't have the appropriate skill, like you're not trained in that skill, you wouldn't be able to use the exploding die. Then it talks about automatic successes and unopposed checks, things like that. Unopposed checks basically set your difficulty level. There's opposed checks using fate. Spending a fate point will let you ignore an attack that would have killed you. Change a minor detail in the game world. You could re-roll a single die roll and use the better of the 2, or add a +2 to a single check. And fate does not automatically regenerate, so you're advised not to waste your points. You get fate points back for heroic actions, good role playing, and achieving character goals, things like that. Chapter 3 is combat. So whenever combat starts, you roll initiative. You roll a d6 for each side, and whoever has the higher side wins and acts first. An optional rule is if you have a character with awareness skill, you can add +2 to your initiative roll. Combat turns are generally short, just a few seconds, so you can only perform a few actions. Running a short distance, drawing a weapon, making an attack, or casting a spell. It's not like D&D where you get an action and then a bunch of free actions and then some minor actions, things like that, where it's literally within a couple seconds you could draw your sword, or you could reload your pistol or something like that. So for the attack roll, it works like any other attribute check, but the difficulty level is always your target's defense plus any applicable modifiers. And attack rolls are subject to the exploding die roll if your character has the appropriate skill. For example, a thief wants to backstab a guard with a dagger. The skill list determines that when using a dagger, the rogue attribute applies. The thief knows this skill, so he may also add +2 to his attack roll. So if you hit, if you score a hit, damage is determined by the number set by the weapon on the weapons list. But damage rolls are always subject to the exploding die rule. And if your hit points are ever reduced to a number equal to 0, your character is dead or dying at the GM's discretion, and hit points can never drop below 0. So there's an optional rule that says characters who are reduced to under half their max hit points are considered seriously wounded and get a -3 modifier on all attribute checks. That's kind of similar to the bloodied rule, I think, in D&D 4th edition. And you heal a number of hit points equal to your highest attribute per day of rest. And only light activities are allowed during that time. If you take part in combat, a chase or some other strenuous activity that could interfere with healing, you only heal a single hit point per day. If your character has the herbalism skill, you could use that ability to speed up healing. And if you receive treatment from a successful heal, you heal an extra 2 hit points per day of rest. Okay, so chapter 4 is magic. If you have a mage attribute of 1 or higher, you have access to spells, which can be found or bought. And spells must first be transferred to your character's personal spell book before they can be used. To cast a spell from the book, you have to make a roll versus the difficulty level of the spell. If it's successful, the caster's mana pool is reduced by the amount listed for the spell. The thaumaturgy skill is helpful but not necessary to cast spells. The range of all spells is line of sight if the spell description does not say otherwise. So there's 4 different circles of spells, which is like, how powerful they are. Circle 1 spells cost 1 mana point and have a difficulty level of 5 to cast. Circle 2 spells cost 2 mana points and have a difficulty of 7 to cast. Third circle spells have a mana cost of 4 and a difficulty of 9. And circle 4 spells have a mana cost of 8 and difficulty of 13 to cast. And again, wearing armor adds the armor penalty score of the armor worn to the mana cost of any spell cast. And then you can do things like enhance your spells and change some things on them to make them harder to cast. Some spells can be sustained, and your mana pool fully refreshes after a good night's sleep. An hour's meditation will refresh the mana equal to a character's mage attribute. So if you don't have the time to take a good, nice, long 8-hour rest, you can sit and meditate for an hour, take a rest, and gain back mana points equal to your mage attribute. Or you can drink a potion that could regenerate your mana. And there's lists for magical implements, things like that. There's a list of spells. There's not a really long list. It's actually really quite short. It's got things like, Frostburn, which is an attack spell, a basic healing spell, light, telekinesis, things like that. Second level spells or second circle spells, you can create food and water, a more powerful heal, identify, lightning bolt, things like that. Third circle has like chain lightning, firebolt, you can enchant your weapon. Fourth circle spells are the really hard ones to cast, the really powerful ones, like summoning elementals, bringing people back to life, things like that. And there's also a variant called Warrior, Rogue, and Scholar. So if you want to do something where there's no magic in your game and you don't really want to call it Mage, you can kind of just call Mage Scholar. And there's some other small, bits of rules and things you can do in there with that. Chapter 5 is equipment. The first thing is all weapons, unarmed or fist. It tells, what the item is, what skill it uses, the damage it causes, and then the range, if it's a ranged weapon, and the cost. And some things are a little odd, like a dragon pistol does a d6 plus 4, which makes sense. It's one of the higher damaging weapons. So you have a minimum of 5 damage and a maximum of 11. However, a dragon rifle does 2d6. So your minimum for a dragon rifle is 2 damage, and a minimum for a dragon pistol is 5. Your maximum is 10. Your maximum here is 12. So you're better off just using a pistol, even though the range is different. So, the GM might want to tweak some of this stuff to better fit his world, but that's just little things like that are kind of odd. But then it's got your armor, your defense. It adds to your defense. The armor penalty cost for casting spells, like if you were to wear heavy plate armor, each spell would cost 5 extra mana. So as you scale up in your powerful armor, that can be a big cost. Then there's some details about the individual armors in magic. There's some magic items listed, healing potions, gauntlets of titanic strength, things like that. And then here's a list of general items like a backpack or a lantern, torches, things like that. Here's what would cost to buy a spell of a certain circle. And of course, something like that, the GM could always say they're a lot harder to get than just buying. So you have to either find them or quest for them or whatever. Different spell books you can get, different magical implements, and there's the cost. And then there's some details of some equipment, which most of it's self-explanatory. And here we have chapter 6, which is game mastering. If you're a player, stop reading here. There's a little dwarf guy sitting below a dragon. There's some tips on running warrior, rogue, and mage. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of this stuff is things that people either already know or, it's just basic stuff like start slow but then go epic. GM rulings instead of rules. Make the world your own. Set the mood with music, things like that. Then there's some information on character advancement. So for character advancement, you don't have levels or get experience points or things like that to improve your stuff or your abilities, whatever. The GM usually decides when a character is ready to advance, and it's suggested here that it usually happens at the end of a successful adventure. If you want to let the characters level faster, you can allow them to advance after every session, every other session, or so on, instead of every adventure. But when the GM allows the player to advance, they can do one of the following: raise an attribute by 1, added 1d6 to either hit points or mana, gain additional skill, or gain a talent. And talents should be harder to get than additional skills or hit points. And you should have to go on a side quest to find a trainer, or admission to a special group to learn something or do a ritual or whatever, because they're pretty unique. And then there's a list of non-combat hazards like falling and poison and fire, things like that. Chapter 7 is the world. There's a gazetteer. It's like a short little gazetteer of the lore of the world that the writer created for this game. There's like some capital cities like Turkale, Vicus, Yokalavi, things like that. There's some notes on the campaign setting. And then we get to the appendix. It's just a quick list of all the skills, all the talents. And some of the talents are a little odd also. Like, for example, tough as nails, damage you take from an individual attack is reduced by 2. That's not very clear. So do you have to say an individual attack such as arrows, or an individual attack as in like, this one individual is attacking me, so my damage is reduced by 2? That's a very odd talent. I would probably either rewrite that into something way, way more specific, or eliminate it completely, because that's a really odd one. But you have other things like Armored Caster. You can reduce the armor penalty for your mana by 2, and you can take it more than once. So the more you take that, you might be able to wear super heavy armor as a mage and not take any spell penalties for your mana. And then things like massive attack. You can add your warrior attribute level to your melee attack damage once per combat. Or, precise shot is the equivalent of a rogue's backstab. And it says that you're free to make up your own talents and things like that. Appendix 2 is optional rules. It's got, rules for, like, say, playing elf, dwarf, halfling, goblin, orcs, things like that. Stuff that is more typical fantasy, but is not necessarily part of the lore that they wrote for this game. And then there's racial talents these other races would get, such as berserker or natural armor, I think, which is something that the lizard man would get. Then there's rules for dual wielding and multiple attacks, mounted combat and vehicle combat, ritual magic for spells that are higher circle than circle 4, and they're just different types of spells. I guess instead of casting like a fireball, you'd have a ritual type spells. And then there's a bestiary, common NPCs such as an apprentice mage, a bandit, a knight, priest, a town guard. And there's animals like bears, dogs, large cats, fire beetles, things like that. Giant spiders. Then there's magical creatures and undead like drakes, elementals, golems, skeletons, and zombies. And then Appendix 4 is a table character creation summary, just pretty short. And then your difficulty levels, casting spells, non-combat hazards, those quick little charts. And then here's the character sheet. It's really simple. You got your attributes, your armor penalties, fate points, hit points, weapons, armor, skills, what attribute uses, and whether you're trained or not. And then the back has lists for talents, spells, items, and then this is an actual spell sheet. Equipment sheets, and then here's an alternate character sheet for Warrior, Rogue, and Scholar if you don't want to have Warrior, Rogue, and Mage. It changes all the Mage stuff to Scholar, and then Scholar. Although it still has armor penalty for spells and mana, which I don't know why, but... And that is it. So there's Warrior, Rogue, and Mage. Hopefully that was a decent little primer / review for everybody. Again, I'll put the link to find this down below. I just printed this copy out myself, took it to Office Max, I think I took it to, and had it spiral bound and put together. And it's a really, really nice little copy, so there you go. Hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks for watching.